Welcome to Wednesday Wisdom.
Good morning. This is Jos Visser, the author of Wednesday Wisdom, and this week's article is called The Black Box Engineer. Decades ago, when I didn't understand a lot about Unix yet, I ran into some weird problem on an HP Unix system where the who command gave incorrect information. I had no clue what was going on until I ran into a colleague who said, "Oh, no problem, I know how to fix that." He logged in as root, opened the etc. utmp file, surveyed the contents, and changed a 1 into a 0. When he saved the file, who gave the expected output again. "Whoa there," I cried out. "What happened there? How does that work?" "I don't know," the colleague who came to the rescue said. "I just know that whenever I have this particular problem, this is the fix." He was a black box engineer. The term black box engineer comes from the wonderful world of monitoring, where we distinguish between white box and black box monitoring. In white box monitoring, we understand the internals of the system under scrutiny and we gather metrics from inside that system in order to figure out what it is going on, how it is doing, and if it perhaps needs a cookie. In black box monitoring, on the other hand, we look at the system from an external perspective and monitor only the endpoints and behaviors that are visible from the outside to the clients who live outside of the system. If you know your system contains a cache somewhere deep inside and you keep tabs on the cache hit rate, you're engaging in white box monitoring. If, on the other hand, you call the external APIs and check the latency and return codes, you're practicing the undervalued art of black box monitoring. Any good system of observability employs both of these methods. I use the term black box engineer to indicate an engineer who knows a lot about a system, but only from this outside perspective. They can use the system, they know all of the knobs and gauges, but they don't really know what is going on under the hood. Black box engineers often function by knowing recipes. They can type in the right commands and push the right buttons, but without true understanding of what is going on. They have no real idea why a recipe works. Also, if the list of recipes is exhausted, they're stuck. There are many problems with operating as a black box engineer. The obvious one being that without true understanding, you might fail to pick up on signals that indicate that the recipe might not work in this particular circumstance, or worse, is actively harmful. The flip side of that is that you might also not recognize the applicability of a certain recipe if the signals are not a perfect match. An additional problem is that as a human you can know only a limited number of recipes and at one point your SD card will be full. When I start working with a new system, I invariably start out as a black box engineer, learning recipes from colleagues or documentation and applying these. However, that will only get me so far. Eventually, I run out of recipes and I have to understand what is actually going on to move beyond the recipes into an area of understanding. Whenever I start a new job, I keep an open file on my desktop where I record the recipes that I used and that worked. But over time, that document gets less and less action as I synthesize from the recipes to a more in-depth understanding of how the system hangs together. And with that understanding, the recipes are no longer needed because understanding by itself generates the right set of commands or actions for almost every situation. The problem here, of course, is time. You need time to build up that understanding. Unfortunately, time is often scarce. Therefore, it is totally okay to be in black box mode when you are new or racing to reach some milestone. But eventually, you will need to create a space-time pocket where you can take a breather and read and think. As a former colleague of mine recently wrote on LinkedIn, every day is a school day. You are either the teacher, the student, or the furniture. It's totally okay to be the furniture for a while, but you have to transition to student mode eventually in order to become really effective at your job. When in furniture mode, you will eventually get into a space where your recipes are not good enough to solve the problem at hand. Here's a recent example from my own experience. For reasons best left undiscussed, I am building virtual machine images for a set of services running on Azure. When I took up this endeavor, I copied some Packer recipes and got going. Eventually, I had to turn up my services in a region where there were only certain machine types available and my images didn't work on these machine types. I asked ChatGPT, I looked at Stack Overflow, and even read some documentation. That's how desperate things got. But none of the things I tried worked. The images I built just kept not working on these newer machine types. At this point, it became obvious that my desperate tweaking of settings would not solve the problem anytime soon, and that I would have to understand how all of it actually hangs together. Sometimes the pushing random buttons approach works, and I can put off understanding what I did and why it works until some later time. But you also have to recognize when the time has come to admit defeat and realize that you actually have to spend some time gaining deep understanding that will help you definitively solve the problem. I often use the weekend for that thinking, since it is typically the time that I get my head out of the bucket. I'm not sure what your work week looks like, but for me, it often feels like someone ties a rope to my feet on Monday morning and then forcefully pulls me through the week. Before I know what's going on, it's Friday afternoon, and I think, what the fuck just happened and where did all that time go? The days where you're desperately trying to get stuff working because you're in the critical path of some milestone are not the best times for the careful thinking, reading, and experimentation that leads to really deep understanding. It's hard to see the bucket when your head is right in it. The one thing I never understand are the people who are content staying in black box mode. Sure, it's impossible to know everything about everything, but I regularly run into people who are happy to know the recipes that they know and deploy those at the right moments. Apart from the obvious lack of self-improvement that results from that attitude, there is the problem that pretty soon an AGI near you will be able to perform that trick better than you, because the AI knows more recipes and can probably apply them faster and more accurately than you can. The future belongs to white box engineers.